Welcome viewers to the series Exploring Careers Creative Design. My name is Masood Atari Lewis, class of 2022 at Middlebury College, and I'd like to introduce this episode's guest speaker. I'm joined today by James Schonzeit, class of 2010, Design and Research Manager with Block, formerly known as Square, a digital payments company which many of us have used. Welcome, and thank you for joining us, James.
Thanks for having me.
James, this series explores a number of different professional roles involved in creative design. Tell us a little about your organization and what you do in your role.
Yeah. So, hey everyone, I'm James. I lead the design team on the Square for Restaurants team at Square. So a bit in there, but to break that down a little bit, design at Square is encompassed by product design, so UX and UI designers, and UX research. And so I oversee both of those teams, trying to make sure that ultimately when we're designing products for restaurants, whether that's servers entering things into the point of sale, a chef moving tickets around on the line in a kitchen, that we are solving the right problems. So solving real problems that they actually have, and then two, solving them in the right ways. And so that's a combination of, depending on where we are in the design process, of trying to understand the scope of a problem, understand what it's like for that line cook who's in the middle of a busy Friday night rush, and then figuring out what are actually their pain points and problems and how can we design solutions to those. So that's a lot of my job today, kind of working across a number of different teams, but most of it is in the design realm.
I imagine working, especially in the restaurant space, like you said, there's a lot of people thinking and designing to do with people. Could you share a bit more with us about how you approach human-centered design and design thinking as it pertains to exact humans?
Yeah, and I mean, broadly speaking, to take it like maybe a step back, when people think about design, often they think about like the way that it looks, the way that it maybe the way that it works. But ultimately, the way that I see design is that it's about decision making. How all these decisions that you're making in terms of how an experience should look, should work, should feel, that's the design process. And the way that we try to guide that is through a deep understanding of our users. So in this case, that is the people that are working in restaurants. And so that's a part of every single product or feature that we're putting out there, is trying to think about, okay, who is this actually for? So who are we designing for? And what are their needs? And so again, whether it's working with the server on how they're entering orders into the point of sale, or trying to take an order table side now is a big new thing. That's where we start the process, but it's also something that happens throughout the process. So we go try to understand the problems, and then once we have some ideas of what solutions might be, we try to bring those back. And I think one thing that's important, is when you're bringing those solutions back or trying to validate that that's the right direction to go in. A lot of folks are like, well, we can launch a survey and we validate it. But I think one thing that I try to push my teams to do more of is get as close to the real context of that user as possible. Because if I were to, send a survey out to 100 servers, yep, that would give me some directional information around some of the decisions I'm trying to make. That's not to bash on surveys; they are right in some contexts. But is that actually taking into account the pressures that they're under when they're taking orders for a table for 8, that a line cook is in, the printer is just rattling things off all night long. So making sure that we can actually get out into actual restaurants and get our products into the user's hands is a really important part of making sure that these things that a tech company is building, right? Not everyone on our team has spent time working in restaurants, has spent time serving guests, but that this tech company, that we can actually design the right solutions to the problems that they have.
Absolutely. And this helps me think a lot about a course I took at Mid, Inclusive Design and Design Justice, where we compared universal design to inclusive design. The idea that, especially in universal design, it's a lot about big data surveys and the aggregate, whereas inclusive design is thinking about one size fits one, exactly. I'm curious to hear more about how that has been working for the Square space, and how you've really been applying one-to-one thinking in terms of how feasible is it and how difficult is it?
Well, one, it blows my mind that there is an inclusive design class at Middlebury now. That makes me so excited. But two, I mean, that's huge. Again, like tech companies historically have a pretty bad track record of designing for themselves, not taking into account the end user's needs, and frankly creating discriminatory biases in their products. And frankly, I think we've been guilty of that at times, where you have a bunch of tech people sitting in a room saying, hey, this is how I think it should be done. We go out and build it, launch it, and then we learn pretty quickly that it wasn't actually what folks were looking for. And I think one example of that is if you think about the actual demographic makeup of restaurant workers, at least in the United States, and you could talk about this globally too, but in the United States, in certain cities, the vast majority of back of house, so kitchen workers, are Spanish speaking. In some cities, I'm not saying everywhere, but take Houston, Dallas, a lot of places in Texas, across the South, and even in major cities. And were we designing our products in a way that supported their needs? If you really think about who's in the kitchen potentially in some of these, and what were we doing by potentially designing products that were either you could choose one language or another, just English or just Spanish, and not actually bridging those gaps and divides and potentially creating barriers and holding people back from maybe moving into another role within the restaurant that might be more lucrative, pay more, because we were creating barriers in our technology. And so one thing that we've been working on is one, making sure that when we are launching surveys that we're putting them into both English and Spanish. So we're actually capturing even owners' perspectives who maybe English is not their first language. But two, testing with folks who are maybe non-native English speakers as well in that process, and making sure that they have the tools that they need. And so one thing that's been interesting that's come out of that was that for restaurants, there are some restaurants where they want to have the restaurant operations in one language, but they want to actually have the guest-facing experience in English. And how do you make sure that you can enable that across the experience? And so that was something that like we knew, broadly speaking, that there would probably be some unique needs for people who are non-native English speakers in their restaurants, but it was something that actually came about because we tested with folks and started to engage with and just spend time with and meeting with non-native English speakers who are using our products today.
That's something I didn't fully think about. I think about inclusive design a lot and how to ensure that what we're creating speaks to an exact user when we design things at the college. But I didn't, in terms of languages and how you can actually create a barrier, even when you give just binary options, thinking about how that flows.
And it wasn't an intentional decision, like that's where if you don't have the people in the room who represent who are representative of the users that we're serving, you can, out of naivety, introduce bias into a situation. So that's where we try as a design team as much as possible to not just like design for our sellers is the term that we use internally for our users, but design with them. And so bring them along in that design process and create ways for them to engage to make sure that the tool that we end up with in 6 months, a year from now, has their input in it at the very beginning and foundation of that process.
Absolutely. And exactly to that, I'm curious about having input, as we discussed in inclusive design and design justice, is one part of the equation, having them submit or share an experience. I'm curious about what it looks like to actually share power in that decision, in terms of to what extent do they get to say no or yes, if at all?
I'm looking at a few ways of changing the power dynamics there. One of them is we've created, or in the process of creating, a restaurant advisory council. So these are restaurant owners from diverse backgrounds of different sizes and helping us input on the decisions that we're making, both on a small level and a larger level. So making sure that we have regular engagement with, like, yes, the most important, like, biggest sellers that we have, but also the smaller sellers to make sure that they have a voice too. I think another way there is actually trying to build a more conscious hiring process too. So beyond just like looking for a diverse range of perspectives, trying to make that clear in terms of how we recruit, and even the job postings that we put out there. When I was hiring for a couple of roles on my team recently, I was very explicit in that I wanted people who come from a hospitality background. Um, and there are frankly a lot of folks, as you might imagine, in the pandemic who, for them, working in a restaurant is both an incredible job, but it's also an incredibly challenging job. And it was just, they'd had enough. And so a lot of folks have been trying to transition from a hospitality role into tech, and that's a really hard leap to make. Some folks have done it, but trying to make sure that we are supporting those pathways for folks who come from a background and have that firsthand experience, but maybe have less time working in tech, can actually engage in this. So those are two, I'd say, ways that we're doing that are, kind of, I guess, creating the context and the structures for folks who haven't traditionally been able to engage in the design process to do so.
I'm very dynamic. And thank you so much for responding to my own curiosities when it comes to design. I want to step back a bit and ask about, what do you most enjoy about what you do? What's the thing that gives you the most satisfaction?
Yeah. I mean, I think it comes back to something I was just talking about, in that running a restaurant, working in a restaurant is incredibly hard. It is one of the, like, for the people that do it, love it, have to love it, because it's grueling. The hours are hard. You're constantly on your feet, and you can make a lot of money, but not everybody does. And they're really risky businesses, right? And so the thing that I find most motivating about it is the idea that if we can solve for some of these problems, maybe we can make it a little bit easier to work in a restaurant. Maybe we can make it a little bit more sustainable for that owner to, like, keep their doors open and keep more folks on staff. Maybe we can make it easier for them to, like, offer more money to their servers, or pay their back of house staff better. And so I really do see how hard it is for a lot of folks in the hospitality industry. And the last thing that should be, there's enough with COVID. I don't want to curse. I was going to curse. I'm not going to on this, so you don't have to bleep it out later. But COVID, it was hard to run a restaurant and work in a restaurant before COVID. Then that happened, and the pandemic happened. And I'm in awe of so many restaurants and folks who have been able to just make it through. And I want to make sure that we are not, at the very least, not getting in their way. So that's the very baseline. But I think being able to actually, go out, and I was out to dinner last night with some friends of mine here in New York, and for better or worse, I can't turn it off now. And the restaurant was using our product Square for Restaurants, and just getting to see them kind of moving through their workflow, working really quickly. It was an easy night for them. Hopefully, we were making good money, but I love being able to actually see that in real life and hear from sellers of, hey, this has been really great. Or also, if you ever meet anyone, a restaurant owner, they will tell it to you straight when you're not meeting their expectations. And I like that level of accountability with design. I don't want to you working on something that just goes out there and I have no attachment to. So that's part of why I took this role in particular versus some other things that I was maybe looking at.
Absolutely. And James, when we met back in 2019, which feels like it was a completely different time,
Yep.
where you were in I don't want to say completely different space, it was still design, but I'm
Yep.
curious about sort of what's inspired the change, and what are some skills that you've taken with you from 2019 pre-pandemic to now?
Yeah. I mean, the big shift was back in 2019. I was working at a design and innovation consultancy called IDEO, which was an incredible place to work, in that one, they really champion and believe in, and have, like, at the core of the culture is a culture built around the idea of human-centered design. And that mindset is really valuable for when you're trying to solve some pretty gnarly and big challenges that maybe don't have easy solutions, are very ambiguous, are emotionally charged. And I got to work on some pretty incredible projects there and really push, I think, my skill set and mindset as both a researcher and a design leader, taking on some incredibly, again, complex, big projects that really pushed me in both of those ways. I think where I made the shift, and I can talk more about what I'm learning now, but I had spent a long time in consulting. I spent over a decade in consulting and had done a lot of these projects where you are helping to shape this big grand vision for what an experience could be. Again, starting with the user's needs to shape that vision. But ultimately, I wanted to be closer to the actual decision making in the day to day of how do we actually bring this to life and have that firsthand relationship that I talked about with like going into a restaurant and seeing people in the kitchen, how they're moving the tickets around. And I wanted a bit more, I wanted to be a bit closer to that. And so that's why I moved to an in-house role at Square where I had opportunities to be working hand in hand at first as a UX researcher with product managers and product marketing managers and engineers to actually build and shape these roadmaps, informing it from a research perspective. And now in my position as a design lead, I'm one of the key decision makers in terms of how we're approaching things, what we're going to prioritize, and how we're going to go about doing that. But taking that lens and really trying to be the advocate on the team. Not that others aren't, but that is the first lens that I take is, are we actually solving a problem for people here? And are we solving it in the right ways? And making sure that that's the voice that I can bring into the conversation as much as possible.
Okay. And I imagine there isn't a wrong or right approach, but I'm curious about if you went back a few years, over a decade, would you prefer to be in-house first or in a consultancy first? Would you reverse that?
I wouldn't say there is a wrong or right approach. I would say there is a more lucrative approach, perhaps. If I had gone right into tech 10 years ago, maybe, I would, and that is a consideration, honestly. But, there are obviously a lot of folks that are choosing consulting and a lot of folks that are choosing tech for various reasons. For me, going into a consulting role right out of school was, sorry, my dog is in the background here. Going into consulting is a great way to get exposure and experience to a very wide range of different types of challenges and industries and approaches, and work with people who are the best in the world at what they do, and to be supported in that too, because again, that's all that agency is really focusing on, is building a strong culture and process around design, at least their consultancy. I think that said, you can grow very quickly also in a or an in-house role. So I think it's ultimately, both paths are definitely valid. I wouldn't trade the experiences I got to have, traveling around the world, working on these incredible things. I'm an expert in so many random subjects now after spending a decade in consulting, but yeah, I don't know. But I don't think I would change it in terms of my path.
Totally. And I love that you note it as a sense of not right or wrong, but in terms of what's most lucrative. That especially speaks to me.
It's
Um,
Yeah, you have to balance those things at where you're at in life too. In my early days, it was like I was just excited to get my hands on and was given a ton of responsibility early on in a consultancy. So, yeah, it kind of depends on where you're at in your journey.
yeah. And I imagine consulting seems like a very natural progression from a liberal arts college. So at Mid, you majored in behavioral economics and film and media culture. And I'm curious about the rest of that story and how that inspired what you did next.
Yeah. I mean, I wish I'd had an inclusive design class when I was at Middlebury, but that's partly why I'm excited to be doing this and getting to meet more students like you. Um, no, so I was I didn't know I wanted to go into design. I didn't actually really even have vocabulary around what design was. I just knew that I wasn't like the other kids in my like econ senior seminar. Um, that like my senior spring, I remember like looking around the room and everyone was going to like management consulting or going to Wall Street or going into finance or something. And it felt like everybody had it figured out. And I was like, wait a minute, what? One, how do you have this figured out? Two, I don't think that's for me. Like I loved the side of economics. I loved the behavioral economics side of things, which you highlighted, in that it was a way of understanding behavior. But I recognized that I wasn't motivated by maybe some of the same things that folks were going into those kinds of roles were. And I knew I had a creative side. That was where the film and media culture side of things came in. I liked getting to make films. I liked getting to. I took a class on like advertising that like blew my mind and gave me a portfolio of work. But I knew I wanted to do something creative and strategic, and that was kind of the blend of those two majors. I just didn't know what that was. And so while I was at Mid, a friend of mine, Evan Daniel, and I started this like we called it a consultancy, I guess. It was sort of like an ad agency where we would work with local businesses in Middlebury and like student groups to help them better connect to the student body. So like the Stoneleaf Tea House was one of our first quote unquote clients, where we did collateral and stuff for them, put stuff up around campus, and in exchange they gave us free tea, which was fun. So things like that. But it gave me a portfolio of work to start showing to folks. And randomly, a friend of mine's father saw some of the work that I was doing. He was like, "That's really interesting. You don't have, especially 10 years ago, too many folks at Middlebury who were doing design." And he was like, "Hey, you should talk to these folks. The creative director at this agency I work with. I think you would just find their work really exciting." And I remember they got me an informational interview with them. I flew out to Chicago for what was supposed to be a 30-minute informational interview. And they had no idea that I flew out from Vermont for this. They thought I was like in town just stopping by. And I ended up talking to the creative director for 2 hours because it just blew my mind that this was this thing that I had no vocabulary for and no one was really talking about yet, but that people got to make these decisions about the things that we interact with on an everyday basis that had never been totally clear to me. In my mind, I was going to go into advertising, and that was at the time like the pinnacle of like creativity and strategy coming into one. But yeah, I kind of discovered that, and then went on this path of. So that was at a packaging design firm. I got an internship there. Ultimately, chose not to go into like an analyst position that I had a full-time offer for. I took a 3-month, poorly paid internship in Chicago to kind of see this out and see, hey, my gut was telling me I wanted to go with that. But that was my first foray into like falling in love with design. But then from there in packaging design, it was this world where I was very excited about like getting to redesign deodorant labels, the laundry detergent bottles, toothpaste packaging. I still find that world very exciting, and kind of those things that you can buy and shop in a grocery store. Like that was my understanding and framing of what design was. It was like design things so that people will consume them. But I started to meet folks in Chicago who were solving bigger questions that didn't, in my mind, equate to what design, quote unquote, was. There was no label on it. There was no packaging to put it in. It wasn't getting sold necessarily. And I was like, wait a minute, I want to do that. And so that's where I kind of discovered this world of design thinking and human-centered design. But anyway, I'm kind of going a little bit further on this, but it was this path of discovery of one, from like knowing through my majors that I wanted to be both doing something creative and strategic that maybe wasn't the traditional path for an econ major, but then two, learning a vocabulary for design and where I fit into it was a process that happened not while I was an undergrad, but actually happened while I was on the job. So going from packaging design to design thinking to then design research within design thinking, and then using design research as a means to bridge to product design, which is the world that I live in now. So it's kind of been a progressive journey that I don't know if I would have drawn a line from in my head from econ and film, but it's what I've been on. So
to hear that your majors can be in one field, but then what you do after based on potentially one class or a few classes that you took at Mid can really inspire what you do next and can really activate something. Do you think you would have taken or found joy in architectural studies, for example?
yeah, yes. I think, yeah, weirdly, a lot of my friends, not weirdly, not surprisingly, a lot of my friends were architectural studies majors and continue to be. I was lucky, for some folks who like knew that they wanted to go into finance. I think I knew enough about architecture to know that like architecture is a very technical job, and it's it's pretty grueling. Requires a lot of master's degrees to actually do it. And I was like, I don't think that's for me. I thought I was like advertising was the thing. So I think I would have loved the opportunity to just have another avenue to create and to learn the design process through. But to be honest, I personally find like, I think the architectural school is fantastic. We have a great program, but I think we should be broadening our definition of what design is, and maybe broadening that major to even just be around different design disciplines, not just architecture, perhaps.
So as we're coming to the end of our chat, I'm curious about what advice, if any, you have for students who are starting their careers like yourself.
I mean, I think the first thing is particularly as a liberal arts graduate, right? Like, we're not coming out of these theater programs. If you want to get into design, we're not coming out of design schools where there are kids who have been doing, industrial design degrees with co-ops in industrial design for 4 years, and that's their entire focus. That said, I think we do bring a really advanced skill set in a lot of other areas in terms of the decision making and how you support decision making and how you can kind of communicate that to others. And I think that's where like folks come out of Middlebury and enter a professional context and people are like, whoa, you don't act like a 22-year-old. You hit above your weight in that realm, but maybe you're lacking some of the design experience or the portfolio that you would get from somebody who came out of a program that they somehow knew that they were going to take on as a 16 or 17-year-old, which I find mind-boggling. I had no idea what I wanted to do. But I think the way, so like, we're not starting from nothing when you're going into a fairly technical and specialized design field. What I would say, though, is that while you have the opportunities at Middlebury, take advantage of them to take on design projects. And that's honestly what I did. Was I got a little space in like the old stone mill when it had first opened, and we started our little design studio. And it was enough to like give me, we didn't spend that much time there, to be honest. We had like some meetings and some sessions there. It was more like a fun place to hang out, but it gave me the confidence to be like, no, I'm gonna put my time and effort into this thing that I'm passionate about outside of my classwork. And that was the thing that gave me my portfolio, that got me my first conversation, that even though my portfolio, when I look back on it now, is pretty laughable, it was enough to show interest and experience, and that I was taking the initiative. Because the last thing is that you want to do is to say, hey, I'm really interested in this field, but then not have, you don't have to have like world-class examples, but you have to show that you are interested and you've taken the initiative and you've learned some of these soft skills that you could come in and contribute and still learn, but can contribute. And so that's where I think Middlebury does a great job of like providing sort of a flexible infrastructure to support either financially or logistically or through space or connections, some of those passions that maybe we aren't getting in the classroom always. And so taking advantage of those, I think, is particularly important when you're trying to break into an industry that is fairly hard to break into. Depends on which path, like UX research versus product design. But yeah, I would say take advantage of those opportunities while you have them.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And thinking about breaking into exact fields, I'm sure viewers are curious about any advice you have in terms of getting into your design space.
Yeah, I was starting to think about that, because I think it is slightly different for product design versus UX research, and that there are slightly different skill sets. To be a product designer, to be a good product designer, you need to be able to think across a few different levels. One is like, you actually need to be pretty technical, because you're the bridge between the user's experience and the engineers and the product managers. So there's a lot of technical decisions. You need to be able to think through that. But two, you also need to have a visual design skill set. And that is something where it's like, I don't know if you remember being in art class or something in high school. I imagine as an architect now, your drawing skills are pretty solid. But that was another reason, honestly, is that I didn't go into architecture, was I wasn't confident in my drawing skills as like a visual designer. Took me a while to build that confidence. But yeah, it does require a visual, an eye and an understanding of the principles of design and what makes something intuitive, elegant, whatever. And so to break into that's where it does, again, matter about showing initiative. And there are constantly projects and products and of big and small sizes that are out there that you can take on. And for me, it was putting together a portfolio, helping my friends with little posters. But it was a way of me just getting to know the tools, learning how folks were making these things that I saw out in the world. But one of the pathways, honestly, is through. There are a lot of for product design, a lot of like product design immersion schools now that are a pretty decent pathway from a non-traditional design background. In a matter of months, you can build up enough of that portfolio and then have, again, something to show. And so there are more and more companies who are kind of supporting that type of a pathway where maybe you haven't focused on that area specifically, but you have a lot of the other skills. You put together that portfolio, and that's enough to get your foot in the door. I would say with like UX research, it's a slightly different skill set, and that you're not expected to necessarily have the same type of like technical understanding of how a product works or the visual design skill set. You need to be able to create a UI. But you do need to have some of those softer skills of like being able to manage stakeholders, to understand what are the questions we're trying to learn about, and then have the confidence to think about, right, or not the confidence, but be able to think about, okay, what's the best way to go about solving these questions and exploring them and using a researcher's mindset there. And honestly, that is a balance of like, I think, academic rigor that you can gain through classes in undergrad of basic understandings of like sociology, anthropology, behavioral science, a lot of different areas there to build that up. But then there are now so taking those skills and employing them in big or small ways, again, in the opportunities that you have. Are there ways to show that like as part of your process of either an assignment or something you're doing outside of schoolwork, that you took a human-centered lens, that you spent the time up front before you made the decisions that, hey, I have this great technology, let me just get this out in the world, that you took the time to actually understand what were the problems you're trying to solve. And so that's what I tend to look for with a more entry-level kind of UX researcher is really just being able to show that they understand, they have an understanding of the process, and they really value and prioritize getting to frame the problem and understand it in a way from a user's perspective before they dive into, hey, here's my solutions. The last thing I'll say there is UX research in particular has been pretty notoriously difficult to break into for a long time. Very few people go to school for it. There aren't as many like portfolio programs that you can go to. A lot of folks will go to like master's programs for 2 years and then transition. But one thing that is cropping up more and more, and when I've had current students or even recent alumni reach out to me about this, I've been keeping an eye on either like associate UX researcher roles, or there are also now specific programs, like I know Lyft has one that they've been spinning up, where they're specifically trying to bring folks from non-traditional research backgrounds, aka you don't have a PhD yet, or you don't have a master's degree, and then giving them pathways into research at an earlier stage. So there are more opportunities starting to be formalized around breaking into this field.
Thank you so much for that. And it was such a joy chatting with you and learning from you. And thank you on behalf of our viewers for spending this time with us.
Of course. Thanks so much for the thoughtful questions and having me here. This was a lot of fun, and it's good to see you again, obviously, after a number of years.
Yeah, same here. Viewers, this concludes this episode within the series Exploring Careers in Creative Design. In closing, I want to encourage you to tune in to get career perspectives and advice from a number of professionals in a broad variety of organizations in other episodes in this series. I also want to encourage you to tune in to other MIDDVantage series, which can be accessed through the Events and Programs tab on the CCI website. Thank you again for watching.